On Friday, June 13, 2025, Los Angeles woke to a city transformed. Federal buildings barricaded, streets eerily quiet, and a sense of unease hanging in the air. The city's familiar pulse was replaced by the hum of military vehicles and the distant echo of orders barked by uniformed men. Yellow tape sliced through familiar streets, cordoning off entire blocks and turning everyday routes into restricted zones. The tape was more than a warning. It was a signal that something fundamental had changed overnight. Marines in full combat gear patrolled downtown, their presence unmistakable and jarring. For many, it was the first time they'd seen active-duty military on their own city streets. A sight that felt both surreal and unsettling. For the first time in modern memory, active-duty U.S. Marines detained a civilian on American soil, a moment that would soon become a flashpoint in the nation's history. The incident unfolded near the Wilshire Federal Building, which had been transformed into a militarized zone, its steps and entrances guarded by armed soldiers and ringed with concrete barriers. The man detained was Marcos Leo, a U.S. Army veteran, an irony that struck a nerve nationwide. Leo, who once wore the uniform himself, now found himself on the other side of the barricade, his military ID powerless to protect him. Cell phone footage of the event spread rapidly, igniting debate about the military's role in domestic affairs. Within hours, the video was everywhere, on news broadcasts, social media feeds, and in heated conversations across the country. The Marines, deployed under presidential order, were there to protect federal property and support overwhelmed police. Their mission was clear, but their presence blurred the lines between law enforcement and military intervention. For Angelenos, the yellow tape marked more than a boundary. It was a visible line between civilian life and military power, a stark reminder of how quickly the ordinary could become extraordinary. When Leo crossed it, he became a symbol of a nation grappling with blurred lines between soldier and police, between protest and security, between rights and restrictions. The consequences of that single step forced a national conversation about civil liberties and the future of protest in America. People questioned what it meant for democracy when the military policed its own citizens. The reverberations from downtown LA would not fade quickly. The city and the country had crossed a line, and there was no going back to the way things were before. Marcos Leo, 27, was not a protester that morning. He was simply heading to a VA appointment, focused on his own thoughts as he made his way through the busy city streets. The sun was just rising, and the city was already alive with movement. But for Marcos, it was just another day, until everything changed in an instant. An immigrant who earned his citizenship through Army service, Leo's story added a deeply personal dimension to the incident. His journey to America had been marked by sacrifice and determination, and serving in the Army was both a duty and a dream fulfilled. For Marcos, wearing the uniform had meant acceptance, belonging, and a chance to give back to his adopted country. Distracted and unfamiliar with the new security perimeter, he crossed the yellow tape without realizing its significance. The city had changed overnight, with barriers and checkpoints suddenly appearing, and Marcos, like many others, was caught off guard by the heightened security measures. Marines, following protocol, detained him swiftly and professionally, restraining his hands with zip ties before handing him to Homeland Security. Their actions were calm and measured, but for Marcos, the experience was jarring. He had never expected to be on the receiving end of such procedures in his own city. After verifying his identity, authorities released him without charges. The encounter was brief, but it left a lasting impression on everyone involved, especially Marcos, who walked away shaken but unharmed. For Leo, the experience was surreal. A veteran, once in uniform, now detained by fellow service members in his own city. The lines between protector and protected had blurred, and he found himself questioning the new reality unfolding around him. His background gave him a unique perspective. He understood the chain of command and the need to follow orders. He knew the Marines were just doing their jobs, but the situation still felt deeply unsettling. Yet his detention highlighted the uncomfortable reality of military authority on American streets. It raised questions about the balance between security and civil liberties, and what it means when soldiers are tasked with policing their own communities. Leo's story resonated with millions, transforming an abstract policy debate into a human narrative. News of his detention spread quickly, sparking conversations across the country about the role of the military in civilian life. The incident forced Americans to confront what it means to serve, and to be served by, their country. It reminded many that the people behind the uniforms are neighbors, friends, and family members. each with their own stories and struggles. For many, it was a wake-up call, a moment that challenged assumptions and inspired a deeper conversation about duty, identity, and the true cost of security in a changing America. The Marines' deployment was the result of weeks of escalating unrest, sparked by aggressive federal immigration raids and mass deportations. Protests in LA, a city with a large immigrant population, grew from peaceful marches to intense clashes as local police struggled to maintain order. Federal buildings became targets, prompting concerns for safety and property. With local law enforcement overwhelmed, the administration invoked the Insurrection Act, bypassing the National Guard and sending active duty troops. Officially, the Marines were there to secure federal property, not to police protests. But for many, the distinction was lost. The sight of combat troops on city streets felt like an act of intimidation. The dynamic shifted from citizen versus police to citizen versus military, raising the stakes for everyone. The stage was set for the tense encounter with Marcos Leo. The city would never be the same. The arrival of 200 active duty Marines in Los Angeles was a dramatic show of force, part of a much larger mobilization that included thousands of National Guard troops. Their presence was impossible to ignore, as convoys rolled through city streets and uniformed personnel took up positions in the heart of Los Angeles. Their mission, according to U.S. Northern Command, was clear: protect federal property and personnel. They were not authorized to engage in law enforcement or crowd control, and were instructed to avoid direct confrontation with civilians whenever possible. Marines established fortified perimeters around key sites, standing guard in full combat gear. The sight of heavily armed troops behind barricades sent a powerful message about the seriousness of the situation. The rules of engagement allowed them to temporarily detain anyone posing a direct threat, as in Leo's case, but required swift transfer to civilian authorities. This delicate balance was meant to prevent escalation, but it was not always easy to maintain. Officials insisted the military's role was passive, focused solely on defense. Yet their presence changed the city's atmosphere overnight, creating a sense of unease and uncertainty among residents. The militarized bubble in downtown LA was both a deterrent and, for some, a provocation. Tensions simmered as protesters and troops eyed each other warily across barricades. Critics warned that such deployments would inevitably lead to incidents like Leo's detention, arguing that the military's presence risked inflaming an already volatile situation. The line between force protection and policing blurred in the chaos, as Marines and law enforcement found themselves working side by side in unpredictable conditions. For many, the city felt less like home and more like a conflict zone. The familiar streets of Los Angeles were suddenly transformed by the presence of armored vehicles and armed patrols. The mission's narrow scope did little to ease public anxiety. Residents questioned whether the military could truly remain neutral in such a charged environment. The consequences were immediate and profound, leaving a lasting impact on the city's sense of safety and trust in its institutions. The legal foundation for the Marines' deployment is a tangle of federal laws. The Posse Comitatus Act prohibits the military from acting as domestic police, except under rare circumstances. The Insurrection Act is the exception, allowing the president to deploy troops if unrest threatens federal law or citizens' rights. The administration cited this authority to justify sending Marines to LA, despite fierce opposition from state leaders and civil liberties groups. Critics argued the situation didn't meet the Act's high threshold and accused the federal government of overreach. Legal challenges erupted, with courts split on whether the deployment was constitutional. The Marines now operate in a legal gray zone, sanctioned but hotly contested. The constitutional struggle is far from over. Amid the uproar, Marcos Leo's own words stood out for their calm and nuance. He described the Marines' conduct as fair and professional, recognizing they were following orders, not making policy. As a veteran, he empathized with the young soldiers, understanding the pressures of duty and protocol. Yet, he admitted the experience was surreal, being restrained by the military in his own city while heading to a VA appointment. Leo's perspective complicated the debate. He neither condemned nor endorsed the deployment but humanized both sides. For some, his words vindicated the Marines. For others, his detention as a veteran and immigrant underscored the risks of military involvement in civilian life. His story reminded the nation that behind every headline are real people, citizens and soldiers alike. Leo's measured response urged a more thoughtful, less polarized conversation. The incident was not just about policy, but about people. Political leaders and legal experts reacted swiftly to Leo's detention. Governor Newsom condemned the deployment as reckless, warning it eroded public trust and escalated tensions. LA's mayor echoed these concerns, pledging to prevent further incidents. Nationally, the event fueled accusations of federal overreach and intimidation, especially after a senator was detained by federal agents the day before. Civil liberties groups argued that using combat troops for domestic security set a dangerous precedent and chilled free speech. Administration officials countered that the Marines acted professionally and within their mandate, pointing to Leo's own statements. For them, the incident was proof the rules of engagement worked. For critics, it was a warning of what could go wrong. The debate over the military's domestic role only intensified. The deployment of Marines in LA reignited fears of a militarized society. Unlike police, soldiers are trained for combat, not community engagement, raising the risk of tragic misunderstandings. The presence of troops blurred the line between law enforcement and military force, unsettling both civilians and veterans. For many, seeing the uniform on city streets was disorienting, eroding trust in institutions meant to protect. Veterans like Leo faced a personal dilemma, torn between their service and their rights as civilians. Critics warned that normalizing such deployments could fundamentally alter the relationship between Americans and their government. A military response to protest risks, escalating unrest and undermining democracy. The peaceful resolution of Leo's case was no guarantee for the future. The debate over militarization is now one of the nation's most urgent. The detention of Marcos Leo is now a historical marker, a precedent for military involvement in domestic crises. The Overton window has shifted. Future protests may face the implicit threat of military force. The sight of Marines on city streets could deepen mistrust and chill free speech, especially in marginalized communities. City and state leaders must now navigate new challenges to their authority. For the military, the risk is politicization and eroding public trust. Service members may find themselves confronting fellow citizens, straining morale and recruitment. The legal battle over the Insurrection Act continues, but the precedent is set. Leo's story, a veteran, immigrant, and citizen, reminds us what's at stake. The line crossed in downtown LA has redrawn the map of civil-military relations for years to come.